This is a reading of Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Chapter 2, The Spirit of Capitalism. In the title of this study is used the somewhat pretentious phrase, the spirit of capitalism. What is to be understood by it? The attempt to give anything like a definition of it brings out certain difficulties, which are in the very nature of this type of investigation. If any object can be found to which this term can be applied with any understandable meaning, it can only be an historical individual, i.e., a complex of elements associated in historical reality which we unite into a conceptual whole from the standpoint of their cultural significance. Such an historical concept, however, since it refers in its content to a phenomenon significant for its unique individuality, cannot be defined according to the formula genus proximum differentia specifica, but it must be gradually put together out of the individual parts which are taken from historical reality to make it up. Thus, the final and definitive concept cannot stand at the beginning of the investigation, but must come at the end. We must, in other words, work out in the course of the discussion, as its most important result, the best conceptual formulation of what we here understand by the spirit of capitalism. That is, the best from the point of view which interests us here. This point of view, parentheses, the one of which we shall speak later, and parentheses, is further by no means the only possible one from which the historical phenomena we are investigating can be analyzed. Other standpoints would, for this as for every historical phenomenon, yield other characteristics as the essential ones. The result is that it is by no means necessary to understand by the spirit of capitalism only what it will come to mean to us for the purpose of our analysis. This is a necessary result of the nature of historical concepts which attempt for their methodological purposes not to grasp historical reality in abstract general formula, but in concrete genetic sets of relations, which are inevitably of a specifically unique and individual character. Thus, if we try to determine the object, the analysis and historical explanation of which we are attempting, it cannot be in the form of a conceptual definition, but at least in the beginning, only a provisional description of what is here meant by the spirit of capitalism. Such a description is, however, indispensable in order to clearly understand the object of investigation. For this purpose, we turn to a document of that spirit, which contains what we are looking for in almost classical purity, and at the same time has the advantage of being free from all direct relationship to religion, being thus, for our purposes, free of preconceptions. Quote, "Remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor, and goes abroad, or sits idle on half of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion of idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense. He has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides. Remember that credit is money. If a man lets his money lie in my hands after it is due, he gives me the interest, or so much as I can make of it during that time. This amounts to a considerable sum, where a man has good and large credit and makes good use of it. Remember that money is of the prolific, generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. 5 shillings churned is 6. Churned again it is 7 and 3 pence, and so on, till it becomes 100 pounds. The more there is of it, the more it produces every turning, so that the profits rise quicker and quicker. He that kills a breeding sow destroys all her offspring to the 1000th generation. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds." End quote. Quote, "Remember this saying, the good paymaster is lord of another man's purse. He that is known to pay punctually and exactly to the time he promises may at any time and on any occasion raise all the money his friends can spare. This is sometimes of great use. After industry and frugality, nothing contributes more to the raising of a young man in the world than punctuality and justice in all his dealings. Therefore, never keep borrow money an hour beyond the time you promised, lest a disappointment shut up your friend's purse forever." Quote, "The most trifling actions that affect a man's credit are to be regarded. The sound of your hammer at 5 in the morning or 8 at night heard by a creditor, makes him easy 6 months longer. But if he sees you at a billiard table and hears your voice at a tavern when you should be at work, he sends for his money the next day, demands it before he can receive it in a lump. Quote, "It shows besides that you are mindful of what you owe. It makes you appear a careful as well as an honest man, and that still increases your credit." Quote, "Beware of thinking all your own that you possess and of living accordingly. It is a mistake that many people who have credit fall into. To prevent this, keep an exact account for some time both of your expenses and your income. If you take the pains at first to mention particulars, it will have this good effect. You will discover how wonderfully small, trifling expenses mount up to large sums, and will discern what might have been, and may for the future be saved, without occasioning any great inconvenience." End quote. Quote, "For £6 a year, you have the use of £100, provided you are a man of known prudence and honesty. He that spends a groat a day idly, spends idly above £6 a year, which is the price for the use of £100. He that wastes idly a grout's worth of his time per day, one day with another, wastes the privilege of using £100 each day. He that idly loses 5 shillings worth of time, loses 5 shillings, and might as prudently throw 5 shillings into the sea. He that loses 5 shillings not only loses that sum, but all the advantage that might be made by turning it in dealing, which by the time that a young man becomes old will amount to a considerable sum of money." End quote. It is Benjamin Franklin who preaches to us in these sentences, the same which Ferdinand Thunberger satirizes in his clever and malicious Picture of American Culture as a supposed confession of faith of the Yankee. That is the spirit of capitalism, which here speaks in characteristic fashion. No one will doubt, however little we may wish to claim, that everything which could be understood as pertaining to that spirit is contained in it. Let us pause a moment to consider this passage, the philosophy of which Kuhnberger sums up in the words, quote, "They make tallow out of cattle and money out of men." End quote. The peculiarity of this philosophy of avarice appears to be the ideal of the honest man of recognized credit, and above all, the idea of a duty of the individual toward the increase of his capital, which is assumed as an end in itself. Truly, what is here preached is not simply a means of making one's way in the world, but a peculiar ethic. The infraction of its rules is treated not as foolishness, but as forgetfulness of duty. That is the essence of the matter. It is not mere business astuteness. That sort of thing is common enough. It is an ethos. This is the quality which interests us. When Jacob Fugger, in speaking to a business associate who had retired and who wanted to persuade him to do the same, since he had made enough money and should let others have a chance, rejected that as pusillanimity and answered that, quote, he, Fugger, thought otherwise. He wanted to make money as long as he could, end quote. The spirit of his statement is evidently quite different from that of Franklin. What in the former case was an expression of commercial daring and a personal inclination morally neutral, in the latter takes on the character of an ethically colored maxim for the conduct of life. The concept spirit of capitalism is here used in this specific sense. It is the spirit of modern capitalism, for that we are here dealing only with Western European and American capitalism is obvious from the way in which the problem was stated. Capitalism existed in China, India, Babylon, in the classic world, and in the Middle Ages. But in all these cases, as we shall see, this particular ethos was lacking. Now, all Franklin's moral attitudes are colored with utilitarianism. Honesty is useful because it assures credit. So are punctuality, industry, frugality, and that is the reason they are virtues. A logical deduction from this would be that where, for instance, the appearance of honesty serves the same purpose, that would suffice, and an unnecessary surplus of this virtue would evidently appear to Franklin's eyes as unproductive waste. And as a matter of fact, the story in his autobiography of his conversion to those virtues, or the discussion of the value of a strict maintenance of the appearance of modesty, the assiduous belittlement of one's own deserts in order to gain general recognition later, confirms this impression. According to Franklin, Those virtues, like all others, are only in so far virtues as they are actually useful to the individual, and the surrogate of mere appearance is always sufficient when it accomplishes the end in view. It is a conclusion which is inevitable for strict utilitarianism. The impression of many Germans that the virtues professed by Americanism are pure hypocrisy seem to have been confirmed by this striking case. But in fact, the matter is not by any means so simple. Benjamin Franklin's own character, as it appears in the really unusual candidness of his autobiography, belies that suspicion. The circumstances that he ascribes his recognition of the utility of virtue to a divine revelation which was intended to lead him in the path of righteousness shows that something more than mere garnishing for purely egocentric motives is involved. In fact, the summum bonum of his ethic, the earning of more and more money, combined with a strict avoidance of all spontaneous enjoyment of life, is above all completely devoid of any eudaimonistic, not to say hedonistic, admixture. It is thought of so purely as an end in itself that from the point of view of the happiness of, or utility to, the single individual, it appears entirely transcendental and absolutely irrational. Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinated to man as a means for the satisfaction of his material needs. This reversal of what we should call the natural relationship, so irrational from a naive point of view, is evidently as definitely a leading principle of capitalism as it is foreign to all peoples not under capitalistic influence. At the same time, it expresses a type of feeling which is closely connected with certain religious ideas. If we thus ask, why should, quote, money be made out of men, end quote, Benjamin Franklin himself, although he was a colorless deist, answers in his autobiography with a quotation from the Bible, which his strict Calvinistic father drummed into him again and again in his youth. Quote, "Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings." End quote. Proverb XXII 29 in parentheses. The earning of money within the modern economic order is, so long as it is done legally, the result and expression of virtue and proficiency in a calling. And this virtue and proficiency are, as it is now not difficult to see, the real alpha and omega of Franklin's ethic, as expressed in the passages we have quoted, as well as in all his works without exception. And in truth, this peculiar idea, so familiar to us today, but in reality so little a matter of course, of one's duty in a calling, is what is most characteristic of the social ethic of capitalistic culture, and is in a sense the fundamental basis of it. It is an obligation which the individual is supposed to feel, and does feel towards the content of his professional activity, no matter in what it consists. In particular, no matter whether it appears on the surface as a utilization of his personal powers or only of his material possessions, parentheses as capital, end parentheses. Of course, this conception has not appeared only under capitalistic conditions. On the contrary, we shall later trace its origins back to a time previous to the advent of capitalism. Still less, naturally, do we maintain that a conscious acceptance of this ethical maxims on the part of the individuals, entrepreneurs or laborers, in modern capitalistic enterprises is a condition of the further existence of present-day capitalism. The capitalistic economy of the present day is an immense cosmos into which the individual is born and which presents itself to him, at least as an individual, as an unalterable order of things in which he must live. It forces the individual, insofar as he is involved in the system of market relationships, to conform to capitalistic rules of action. The manufacturer, who in the long run acts counter to these norms, will just as inevitably be eliminated from the economic scene as the worker who cannot or will not adapt himself to them. As the worker who cannot or will not adapt himself to them will be thrown into the streets without a job. Thus, the capitalism of today, which has come to dominate economic life, educates and selects the economic subjects which it needs through a process of economic survival of the fittest. But here one can easily see the limits of the concept of selection as a means of historical explanation. In order that a manner of life so well adapted to the peculiarities of capitalism could be selected at all, i.e., should come to dominate others, it had to originate somewhere, and not in isolated individuals alone, but as a way of life common to whole groups of men. This origin is what really needs explanation concerning the doctrine of the more naive historical materialism that such ideas originate as a reflection or superstructure of economic situations. We shall speak more in details below. At this point, it will suffice for our purposes to call attention to the fact that without doubt, in the country of Benjamin Franklin's birth, Massachusetts, the spirit of capitalism, in the sense we have attached to it, was present before the capitalistic order. There were complaints of a peculiar calculating sort of profit-seeking in New England, as distinguished from other parts of America, as early as 1632. It is further undoubted that capitalism remained far less developed in some of the neighboring colonies, the later southern states of the United States of America, in spite of the fact that these latter were founded by large capitalists for business motives, while the New England colonies were founded by preachers and seminary graduates with the help of small bourgeois craftsmen and yeomen for religious reasons. In this case, the causal relation is certainly the reverse of that suggested by the materialistic standpoint, but the origin and history of such ideas is much more complex than the theorists of the superstructure suppose. And you know who the theorist of the superstructure is, yeah. The spirit of capitalism, in the sense in which we are using the term, had to fight its way to supremacy against a whole world of hostile forces. A state of mind, such as that expressed in the passages we have quoted from Franklin, and which called forth the applause of a whole people, would both in ancient times and in the Middle Ages have been prescribed as the lowest sort of avarice, and as an attitude entirely lacking in self-respect. It is, in fact, still regularly thus looked upon by all those social groups which are least involved in or adapted to modern capitalistic conditions. This is not wholly because the instinct of acquisition was in those times unknown or undeveloped, as has often been said, nor because the auri sacra fams, the greed for gold, was then or now less powerful outside of bourgeois capitalism than within its peculiar sphere, as the illusions of modern romanticists are wont to believe. The difference between the capitalistic and pre-capitalistic spirit is not to be found at this point. The greed of the Chinese mandarin, the old Roman aristocrat, and the modern peasant can stand up to any comparison, and the aurosacra fams of a Neapolitan cab driver or a baracolo, and certainly of Asiatic representatives of similar trades, as well as of the craftsmen of Southern European and so many commas within commas, as well as of the craftsmen of Southern European or Asiatic countries, is, as anyone can find out for himself, very much more intense, and especially more unscrupulous than that of, say, an Englishman in similar circumstances. The universal reign of absolute unscrupulousness in the pursuit of selfish interests by the making of money has been a specific characteristic of precisely those countries whose bourgeois capitalistic development, measured according to Occidental standards, has remained backward. As every employer knows, the lack of conscienciosità of the laborers of such countries, for instance, Italy as compared with Germany, has been, and to a certain extent still is, one of the principal obstacles to their capitalistic development. Capitalism cannot make use of the labor of those who practice the doctrine of undisciplined liberum arbitrium any more than it can make use of the businessman who seems absolutely unscrupulous in his dealings with others, as we can learn from Franklin. Hence, the difference does not lie in the degree of development of any impulse to make money. The auri sacra fams is as old as the history of man. But we shall see that those who submitted to it without reserve as an uncontrolled impulse, such as the Dutch sea captain who, quote, would go through hell for gain, even though he scorched his sails, end quote, were by no means the representatives of that attitude of mind from which the specifically modern capitalistic spirit as a mass phenomenon is derived, and that is what matters. At all periods of history, wherever it was possible, there has been ruthless acquisition, bound to no ethical norms whatever. Like war and piracy, trade has often been unrestrained in its relations with foreigners and those outside the group. The double ethic has permitted here what was forbidden in dealings among brothers. Capitalistic acquisition as an adventurer, has been at home in all types of economic society, which have known trade with the use of money, and which have offered it opportunities through commenda, farming of taxes, state loans, financing of wars, ducal courts, and office holders. Likewise, the inner attitude of the adventurer, which laughs at all ethical limitations, has been universal. Absolute and conscious ruthlessness in acquisition has often stood in the closest connection with the strictest conformity to tradition. Moreover, with the breakdown of tradition and the more or less complete extension of free economic enterprise, even to within the social group, the new thing has not generally been ethically justified and encouraged, but only tolerated as a fact. And this fact has been treated either as ethically indifferent or as reprehensible, but unfortunately unavoidable. This has not only been the normal attitude of all ethical teachings, but, what is more important, also that expressed in the practical action of the average man of pre-capitalistic times. Pre-capitalistic in the sense that the rational utilization of capital in a permanent enterprise and the rational capitalistic organization of labor had not yet become dominant forces in the determination of economic activity. Now, just this attitude was one of the strongest inner obstacles which the adaptation of men to the conditions of an ordered bourgeois capitalistic economy has encountered everywhere. The most important opponent with which the spirit of capitalism, in the sense of a definite standard of life claiming ethical sanction, has had to struggle was that type of attitude and reaction to new situations which we may designate as traditionalism. In this case also, every attempt at a final definition must be held in abeyance. On the other hand, we must try to make the provisional meaning clear by citing a few cases. We will begin from below with the laborers. One of the technical means which the modern employer uses in order to secure the greatest possible amount of work from his men is a device of piece rates. In agriculture, for instance, the gathering of the harvest is a case where the greatest possible intensity of labor is called for, since, the weather being uncertain, the difference between high profit and heavy loss may depend on the speed with which the harvesting can be done. Hence, a system of piece rates is almost universal in this case, and since the interest of the employer in a speeding up of harvesting increases with the increase of the results and the intensity of the work, the attempt has again and again been made by increasing the piece rates of the workmen, thereby giving them an opportunity to earn what is for them a very high wage, to interest them in increasing their own efficiency. But a peculiar difficulty has been met with surprising frequency. Raising the piece rates has often had the result that not more but less has been accomplished in the same time, because the worker reacted to the increase not by increasing but by decreasing the amount of his work. A man, for instance, who at the rate of 1 mark per acre mowed 2.5 acres per day and earned 2.5 marks, when the rate was increased to 1.25 marks per acre, mowed not 3 acres as he might easily have done, thus earning 3.75 marks, but only 2 acres, so that he could still earn the 2.5 marks to which he was accustomed. The opportunity of earning more was less attractive than that of working less. He did not ask, how much can I earn in a day if I do as much work as possible, but how much must I work in order to earn the wage, 2.5 marks, which I earned before and which takes care of my traditional needs. This is an example of what is here meant by traditionalism. A man does not, quote, by nature, wish to earn more and more money, but simply to live as he is accustomed to live and to earn as much as is necessary for that purpose. Wherever modern capitalism has begun its work of increasing the productivity of human labor by increasing its intensity, it has encountered the immensely stubborn resistance of this leading trait of pre-capitalistic labor, and today it encounters it the more backward, parentheses, from a capitalistic point of view, and parentheses, the laboring forces are with which it has to deal. Another obvious possibility, to return to our example, since the appeal to the acquisitive instinct through higher wage rates failed, would have been to try the opposite policy, to force the worker by reduction of his wage rates to work harder to earn the same amount than he did before. Low wages and high profits seem even today to a superficial observer to stand in correlation. Everything which is paid out in wages seems to involve a corresponding reduction of profits. That road capitalism has taken again and again since its beginning. For centuries, it was an article of faith that lower wages were productive, i.e., that they increased the material results of labor, so that, as Pieter de la Cour on this point, as we shall see, quite in the spirit of the old Calvinism, said long ago, the people only work because and so long as they are poor.
But he's not saying that.
No, he's saying that that's the ethos that was in place in the pre-capitalistic society for motivating the resistance to a capitalistic efficiency standard was that the mindset wasn't in place among the workers.
They're just too lazy, basically.
Or they are seen in present Spirit of Capitalism as having been lazy, but they were just doing what they felt they needed to do in terms of work to live a comfortable life, and so they didn't have that raw acquisition
so they were
driver
by capitalism, basically, like imbuing in them the spirit of productivity that otherwise wouldn't exist.
And it was through what he'll argue is its association with Protestantism.
Okay.
Yeah, which is like the duty-bound driver.
Okay.
Working for work's sake.
As being the path to salvation, kind of.
Yeah.
And no wonder it's English, right?
It is based in America as the true instantiation of that spirit.
Oh, interesting.
Where I believe, I don't know if this is the argument that he'll make, but I think the idea that many Western European and English Protestants and other branches of Christianity that are similar left the old world for the new world as a chance of like actualization of their spiritual ideals.
Okay.
And so they had a more pure form of expression in the new world than they would have had in England or Western Europe.
Which was fettered by the ancient relationships with the church
and traditionalism as he's describing it.